Okay guys, welcome back to part 2 of the tutorial series on how to use the map making asset that I have created for Unity. So now that we have imported everything that we need and set up our project, let's go ahead and start creating our first map. And we'll take a quick look at how to navigate Unity as a whole for those of you who have never used the program at all. First things first is by using the middle mouse button, we can pan our camera around in the scene. We can actually go back to the example scene to better show how we navigate. So the middle mouse button will pan us around. By holding Alt and using the left click, we can rotate. We can also use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out, or we can hold Alt and use the right click to use the magnifying glass. If we middle click somewhere, that will set our camera's center point. So for instance, if I were to have my camera center point over here on the grass, and then I were to try zooming in on this rail, it would be tough to properly align my camera with it. The pivot point is way off in that corner. So now if I want this rail to be my focus, I can simply middle click on the rail, and now I'm pivoting around where I middle clicked. The other tools up here are our move tool. This is how we move objects around in the scene. If I want to move this trash can around, I can click on it with the move tool selected, and I can drag these arrows to move it along the respective axis. I can also use this plane here rather than the arrow to move it along everything but the up and down axis, and the same is true with these planes to their relative axes. Control Z, of course, undoes our previous action. We also have our rotate tool. We can go ahead and rotate our trash can here in any direction that we please. And then we have our scale tool, which does exactly as you would expect. We can scale our trash can in any which way. Something to note is that all of these tools affect the transform, which is over here, and we can do very precise rotations by typing in numbers into the values of our object's transform. Another thing we can do is with the rotate tool, for instance, if we were to rotate and then hold Control, it'll snap it to a specific rotation. Our rect tool, or rectangular scaling tool maybe, is a tool we can use to scale some objects along only a rectangular path like this, so I can drag these specific parts out and in. This is an okay tool, but frankly I don't find myself using it very often, and for some reason it doesn't work on prefabs. I don't know what the deal is there. And then of course our final tool is the move, rotate, and scale tool all in one. Something to note about this tool that's actually fairly useful is that while using ProGrid, while the move tool snaps to the ProGrid, the move, rotate, and scale tool does not snap. This can be useful if we want to move things only a slight amount. Holding Control while using this will allow it to snap. Another tool that's very useful is our Vertex Snapping tool. If I hold V while I have the move tool selected, it will allow me to hover my mouse over the vertices of the object, so I can grab this vertex by holding V and then left clicking, and now I'm moving the object by that vertex, and if I continue holding V and left click, it is snapping to other vertices in the scene. So I can snap this vertex of this trash can to this vertex of this ledge. This is an incredibly useful tool when the ProGrid snapping just isn't as precise as we want. One other thing to note is that while ProGrid is enabled, the vertex snapping will continue to snap to ProGrid, so we can turn that off and get the absolute most precise snap possible. A couple quick notes about ProGrid. This is the size of our grid, the increment. This allows us to see the guidelines. This is fairly useful. We can change the guideline that's being rendered with these tools here. Having the Y guide grid enabled can be quite useful when trying to align rails up with other rails and whatnot at a distance. And we can also just turn that back off. If we were to select this object, this button here will snap the object to the grid. So as you can see before, it was not aligned to the grid, and now it is. Be careful with this though, as sometimes it can kind of mess things up. This tool will lock the grid so that it doesn't move around when we move objects, whereas if that is unlocked, the grid sometimes moves with the object and whatnot. You can kind of fiddle with that. And then this final one renders all 3 planes at once, and we can of course close it by clicking on the word grids. A couple other things about Unity that are good to know when trying to navigate. This is our lighting tool. If we want to see the scene without lighting, perhaps your lighting is making it difficult to see something in the scene, we can click that button and it will disable all of the lighting in the scene, giving it only a flat light view. And we can re-enable that to view it in lighting mode. These are our view modes. We have shaded, wireframe, etc. There's a lot of stuff here that we can play with, but for the most part you'll probably almost always be working in the shaded mode. Another feature that's fairly useful is if we click on this gizmos button, we can go ahead and change the size of the gizmo icons, which is all of these kind of icons that show where something has an icon. So for instance, our spawn point has this tag, has the pin icon that I created and put in, or our scene settings has the map creator icon that I created and put in, and we can just go ahead and make all of those smaller so that they take up a little less screen space. You can also completely disable 3D icons and make them 2D icons, but I like to have the 3D icons so you can change the size. And of course we can go through here and play around with disabling and enabling all of these gizmos if they bother you. So now let's go ahead and take a look at our assets folder and kind of navigate around what we've got going on over here. So for starters, we have our hierarchy. This will be over here by default. I have moved my project window over here, just the way I like the layout. And then your inspector is over here. You can arrange these in any way you would like, and you can even add more tabs by doing this. And I, for instance, have another project tab on my other monitor, which I find very useful. This is our object inspector on the right, which is what lets us, well, inspect objects. So for instance, if we just click on our trash can again, we can take a look at it. It's a prefab. And if we were to double click on it, we can kind of go into the prefab a little more. And by going over here to the hierarchy, we can take an even more detailed look at what's inside of it. So our trash can is in the props folder that I've created here. And it has its body object and the frame object. This is just the way that I created it in Blender. And of course, each of these have a mesh renderer, which is rendering the mesh that was given to it by Blender. And then I've also put mesh colliders on these objects, which is what adds a three-dimensional collision for the skater to interact with the object. If it doesn't have the collider, your skater can just ride right through it and will not interact with the object. Everything in this scene has been, if we take a look at, if we come over here and take a look at our project, we have the assets folder, which is what holds all of our assets that we'll be using. The asset bundles folder is where our maps will be getting exported to when we export them. These two folders, or these two files, we will never use, and this file is also something that we will not use. But this here, builder test, is the actual map file of this. And by dragging this into my SkaterXL maps folder, it makes the map playable. If I want to make that a little easier, I can right click on it and show an explorer, and it'll open up where this is. From here, I can literally just drag and drop to the maps folder, replace since I've already got it, and now that map is playable. We will be creating new asset bundles when you guys export your own maps, but this is a good example of how to get this to SkaterXL. The presets folder is a settings folder that you probably will not need to mess with much. In the required folder, I've gone ahead and just stashed away a few things that are necessary for the map creation process that you also don't really need to mess with. In our scenes folder, of course, we have our scenes. We have our builder example scene that we have here. And then we have the sample scene that comes default with Unity. by double clicking on the main camera. Over here I've recentered everything up. In this folder, the SDT assets default, this is all of the map creation tools that this is all of the pre-made assets that I have created for use in Unity. The backend folder is something that you don't need to mess with, but you can take a look if you'd like. This is simply where all of the models and textures and physics and whatnot that are used in the props, or that are used in the objects, have been stored. So this is where my shaders are, and the tree textures, and all the other textures, etc. Once again, you probably won't need to be using this folder much until you start getting into things. The folder that you'll be using for starters is the map creation folder. In here there are 3 smaller folders. The prefabs folder is where all of our objects are. Anything 3-dimensional is here. So I can just go ahead and drag and drop objects directly into the scene, and there it is. Our skater is now, our reference skater that I like to use when making maps is now in the map. There's a lot of stuff in here, ledges, and ledges, pads, rails, ramps, our reference skater, scenery like buildings and trees, and stairs. The default map creator asset doesn't ship with a ton of assets, but what it does have should all function perfectly as far as possible within the physics of the game. And of course, you will hopefully be able to download more assets in the future. Our last folder that we'll take a look at, the next 2 folders in the map creation folder are things we'll go over in a little bit here, but we have our styles folder, and we have our triplanar materials folder, and I'll cover these things in the future. Finally, we have the spawnables folder, and all you'll need to use in here, once again, these 3 folders are essentially kind of back-end folders, and then the spawnables folder is where our 3-dimensional objects actually are. And just like with the assets default folder, we can just drag and drop stuff directly into our scene. Alright, so we've gone ahead and covered how to get started in Unity and how to use our navigation tools in the Unity editor. In the next video, we'll actually start getting into making the map. Thanks for watching, guys.